In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one man who has never once told a crowd to hurry, 9 years on the platform speakers, and not on the worst day of his life either. You say hurry, and the crowd hears late. And late is the word that makes a grown man climb over a woman to reach a door. Hey, I'm your brother from the void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from a voice in the roof girders, the flat, unhurried one that tells 11,000 frightened people they're exactly on time and is believed. The Tau lifted 4,000 of his people off a dead port and fed them for 3 years. The Holy Ordos shot all 4,000 in 11 days. He called both queues, same voice, same phrasing. Not one of them ran. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
I have never once told a crowd to hurry, not in 9 years on the platform speakers, not on the worst day of my life, not on the day after it. You say hurry and the crowd hears late, and late is the word that makes a grown man climb over a woman to reach a door. That is the whole trade. Any fool with a throat can shout. The trade is a flat, unhurried voice coming down out of the roof girders, while everything underneath it is coming apart, telling 11,000 people that they are exactly on time, and that the second pan is now loading. Second pan, and then listening to them believe it, because in a room full of frightened people, a calm voice is the loudest thing there is. 4,000 of them walked into a ditch on my voice. They went in the order I gave them, 10 abreast, and they kept the spacing I asked for, and not one of them ran. The Tau lifted 4,000 of my people off a dead port and kept them fed for 3 years. The Holy Ordos shot all 4,000 in 11 days. I called both queues. Same voice, same phrasing, same downward turn at the end of the line that tells a crowd the instruction is finished and there will not be another one. Nobody is late. There is a man behind the glass in front of me. He has a rack of brass spools and a listening horn and a small hammer he uses on the side of the machine when it sulks. And he has told me twice that I should speak naturally. I told him that nobody speaks naturally into a machine, and that if he wanted natural, he should have hidden the machine, and he wrote that down, which tells you what kind of a man he is. There was a warden of the Ordo in the corner for the first 2 hours of the first day. He sat with his hands flat on his knees and listened to me describe the port at Vorlach, and the water and the queue at Gate 9. And at the end of the second hour, he stood up and went out, and he has not come back, and nobody has been put in his place. I understand the reasoning, and I would have arrived at it myself. Nothing in this account is a secret, and I have not been told to leave any of it out. There is a tech priest as well, who comes in at the top of every session and says the rites over the rack and goes out again, and who has not once in 10 hours looked at me. The man behind the glass waits for him with his hands folded, the way a boy waits for grace at a table, and starts the spools the moment the door shuts. He is not permitted to say why they want 10 hours of me. I asked once on the first morning out of habit. I do not intend to ask again. My name is Kolm Vrooten. I was a caller, not a herald, not a proclamator, nothing with a robe. A caller is the voice in the roof of a working building, and on Sundrach, the working building was the lift head at Vorlach, which is why anybody off-world has ever had to say the name Sundrach out loud at all. We were a salt world with a bad sky. 240 million people scraped in a ring around the shallow seas, boiling brine in pan fields you could see from orbit, cracking it down to the reagent salts that the Forge Worlds up in the passage put into their ammunition primers, and shipping every gram of it through Vorlach, because Vorlach had the only stack the Mechanicus had ever certified on our planet. Everything went up through us. Nothing that mattered came down. I have met people who think a lift head is a romantic place. Those people have never stood in the loading halls at Fourth Bell, with 60,000 shift workers pushing in one direction and 40,000 pushing in the other, and one voice, mine, holding both of those rivers apart with nothing but timing. I started at 17, which is younger than they usually take, because my father coughed himself out of the trade and somebody had to keep the room. He had the flat lungs you get from 20 years of brine air, and by the end of it, he could not hold a sentence to its finish. And a caller who runs out of breath in the middle of an instruction is worse than no caller at all, because the crowd hears the gap and fills it with whatever it is already afraid of. They gave me his booth and his chair and his throat lozenges, which were made of something gray and tasted of the inside of a lamp, and they told me the 2 rules of the trade on the first afternoon. Never say hurry. Never tell the crowd the true time. That is it. 9 years of apprenticeship in 10 words. Tell 40,000 tired people that the last hopper of the shift departs in 6 minutes, and 40,000 people begin to run, and the ones who fall are not usually the ones who were running. Tell them 20 minutes, in the same voice at the same interval, and they walk, and the hopper leaves in 6 minutes with everyone aboard who was ever going to make it, and nobody is trampled at the mouth of Gate 9. Educated people have told me since that this is a moral matter. It is a cue. I do not explain things. That was never my work. My work was telling people where to stand and in what order, and explanation is the enemy of order, because the moment you begin explaining, the crowd understands that you are asking rather than telling, and a crowd that has been asked will negotiate. I will tell you where everybody stood. There were 2 of us in the roof by the end. Ilka Donneborg came up to the booth in my 6th year, sent by the port school because she had the voice and because her family had nothing else to give her, and she was better than me inside 2 years, which I told her once, and then never again, because you do not feed a second voice its own notices. She had the trick I have never had. She could hear a crowd change, not see it, hear it. A crowd about to go bad makes a particular sound, a rising thin thing under the general noise, and Ilka heard it 4 or 5 seconds before I did, and 4 or 5 seconds is the whole business. She used to sit with her boots up on the console eating salt biscuits, and she would put a hand flat on the desk and say, "Gate 4 is going to sour," and I would call Gate 4, and Gate 4 would settle, and she would go back to her biscuits without ever once looking pleased about it. 22 years old. The other thing to know about me, and it is not small, is that I am no good with numbers. Figures slide off me the way water slides off treated canvas. In 9 years of running the busiest floor on the planet, I never once carried a manifest count in my head, because the counting was done by the tally office, and the pans had their own weights, and the whole point of a caller is that he does not do anything except speak. I could hold 11 separate instructions in sequence and deliver them in the right order over 4 hours without a note in front of me. Ask me how many people were in the hall, and I would tell you it was a busy day. That is the crack everything else went through. Sundrach sat 2 jumps in from the core ward edge of the Kren Passage, which is a stretch of nothing much with 14 inhabited systems in it. And for my entire life, the passage was quiet in the way that a corridor is quiet. Things went through. Nothing stopped. We knew there were Xenos out past the far end of it. Everybody on a frontier world knows there are Xenos somewhere, the way everybody knows there is weather. The catechisms are read at shift muster. The lithographs go up in the transit halls. The ecclesiarchy sends a preacher round the pan fields twice a year to tell the brine crews that the alien is a lie in the shape of a friend. And then the preacher gets back in his transport, and everybody goes back to boiling salt. I had seen precisely one piece of Xenos in my life before any of this. A green-skinned skull bolted over the door of the Port Authority with a plaque saying where it had come from, and it had been up there so long that the boys used to hang their wet gloves on it. The war came to us the way weather comes to a flat country. You do not see it arrive. You see the light change 3 days out, and everyone stops talking about it, and then it is on you. Ships began coming down at Vorlach that had no business at a salt port. Navy tenders and hospital transports, and a militarum staff barge with a Lord General's pennant that sat on the #1 pan for 11 days doing nothing at all. And the tally office started running priority schedules I had never been given the codes for. I called those schedules anyway. That is the job. A caller does not need to understand a manifest. He needs to pronounce it clearly and put the stress in the right place so that a man who has been awake for 30 hours can hear his own gate number through 400 meters of bad air. For 7 weeks, I read out cargo priorities in a voice like a man reading a shipping list. And every one of those weeks, the ratio changed. And by the end of it, we were lifting more people than salt. I noticed the change before anyone told me, and I noticed it because of the sound. A hall full of workers has one noise. A hall full of families has another. Families are quieter and slower, and they stop in the wrong places because a man traveling alone walks to the number he was given, and a man traveling with his mother and his 3 children walks to the number, then back, then to the wall to sit her down, then forward again, and multiply that by 50,000 and you have a floor that no longer flows. I sent a request down to the Port Authority asking whether we were now running an evacuation, because if we were, I wanted to change my phrasing, and the request came back stamped with a line saying that the movement was a rationalization of personnel, and that existing terminology was to be maintained. So I maintained existing terminology. For 9 more days, I called an evacuation using the words for a shift change. And the families heard the words for a shift change, and they packed the way you pack for a shift. 1 change of clothes, a tin of something. Nothing at all for a child. The fighting never came to Vorlach. People assumed afterwards that I had been under guns. I had not. The Tau came down 4,000 kilometers south of us on the pan fields at the Orsenbright Shallows, and they took the southern brine belt in 9 days, and they did it without touching the population. That was the part nobody in the Port Authority could make sense of. We had been raised on the lithographs, the alien as a lie in the shape of a friend, and the first hard news that came up the line from the south was that the pan crews at Orsenbright had gone back to work on the 4th day under a Xenos flag, and were being paid in the same script they had always been paid in. Our own militarum garrison, the Sundrach 9th and 11th Auxilia, went south to meet them and did not come back. And the survivors who did come back were not many and were not talkative, and the Port Authority put them on the first hulls out with the medical priority stamp, which was the first time I understood what the priority schedule was actually for. The schedule was not for people. It was for the things a war needs in a hurry, somewhere else. I read it out for 9 weeks. First, the certified stack components, which meant the Mechanicus stripped the head of our own lift and shipped it, piece by consecrated piece, in armored cradles. Then the reagent salt stock, which was 11 years of pan field output sitting in bonded silos, because primers do not make themselves and the forge worlds up in the passage were screaming for it. Then Navy and Militarum personnel, then the tithe records and the shrine relics and the administratum cadre. Then at the bottom of the sheet, in the place where the least important cargo goes, the population of a world of 240 million. Nobody hid this. There was no conspiracy at Vorlach. The schedule was posted. It hung in the transit halls on printed board in letters a hand high over the lithograph of the alien and the lie, and men queued past it every morning and read it and understood it perfectly. Nobody rioted. You do not riot about the weather either. By the last week, we were lifting whoever we could fit in the gaps. Not by ballot, not by need, by fit. A hopper comes back down with 311 spaces in it because of how the Munitorum crates were stacked at the far end, and the caller is the man who fills those 311 spaces, and he fills them from whichever gate is closest to the ramp, because the alternative is to run a selection in a hall of 40,000 and see how that goes. I filled them from whichever gate was closest to the ramp. For 6 days, that was my entire contribution to the salvation of my species. Gate 7. First 200, walk on. Gate 7. Next 111, walk on. Thank you, that gate is now closed. The next call will be in 20 minutes. There was a man on the 4th day who had brought his loom, a whole floor loom in pieces, roped on a handcart, 3 generations of it. And he had got that cart from the eastern districts to the mouth of Gate 5 through a city that was coming apart, which I still consider the single most impressive act I witnessed in that entire period. He wanted assurances about the loom. I told him the loom would be catalogued. He asked in what class. I told him the loom would be catalogued in the class appropriate to the loom, and he went up the ramp happy. And the loom went into the Port Authority incinerator with about 900 tons of other things people had carried across a dying city, because that is what the bins under the ramp were for. He is one of the ones who lived. If he is alive now, he is somewhere in the passage, telling people that he lost everything, and he does not know how right he is about the everything, and how wrong he is about the losing. On the last day, the prefect came up to the booth in person, which he had never done, and the fact that he climbed 140 steps to do it, rather than using the Vox, is the reason I knew before he opened his mouth. Duran Melcaster. A dry, decent, entirely ordinary official, 3 years off his pension, the sort of man who signed things at the correct angle. He told me the fleet was standing off. He told me the Mechanicus had begun the denial protocol on the stack head at noon, and that once the stack came down, there would be no further lift from Vorlach. Not that day, not ever, because the certification took 40 years, and the seneschals who granted it were 9 jumps away. He told me there were 2 hulls left on the pans, and that both were loading now, and that between them they had capacity for about 6,000, and that there were 41,000 people inside my halls. Then he gave me 2 chits. Port Authority Staff Grade 4, myself and Donneborg, seats reserved. He put them on the console face down, which I thought was a courtesy at the time, and which I now think was a man who could not look at his own hand doing it, and he said the thing that everybody says at the end, which is that I should keep the halls moving as long as I could. I said I would. He shook my hand, which he had never done in 9 years, and he went back down the 140 steps, and that was the last I saw of the prefect Duran Melcaster, until his signature turned up 3 years later on a table in a shed, in front of me, with the seals still on it. I kept the halls moving for 5 hours and 40 minutes, which is the only thing I have ever been able to do. My voice did not go up once. I never said the word hurry. I never said the word last. I never said the word final. Loading was continuing. The intervals between calls might lengthen, and this was normal. I moved gates in a rotation so that no part of the hall could see it was being starved. Ilka worked the low speakers on the floor itself, the ones you use for close instruction, and she went out among them with a handcaster and stood on a bench in the middle of Gate 4 for an hour, 22 years old, talking to a crowd of 9,000 people about spacing, and Gate 4 did not sour. I told her twice to use her chit. Both times she looked at me the way you look at a man who has said something that does not require an answer, and went back to her microphone. She did not make a speech about it. If she had made a speech, I would have picked her up and carried her to the ramp. It was the not making a speech that made it impossible. The second hull lifted at 4 minutes past the 20th bell. I know that because the tally office called it up. When a hull lifts from a pan at Vorlach, you do not hear an engine, you hear the hall. Because 40,000 people all understand the same thing in the same second, and the noise they make is not a shout. It is lower than a shout. It comes up through the floor. Ilka had her hand flat on the desk, and she did not need to tell me what was coming, and I put my thumb on the key, and I gave the halls a full instruction, in the same voice I had used every day for 9 years, telling them that the pan side doors were now closed and that everyone was to withdraw to the eastern concourse and wait for the next call. And they did it. 41,000 people. They went east because a voice in the roof told them to, and they waited in the eastern concourse for a call that was never coming, some of them for 2 days. The stack head came down an hour later. The mechanicus did it properly, charges at 4 levels, and the whole thing folded south into the empty pan fields and made a dust cloud you could see for 100 kilometers, and for about a minute, everything in the city was quiet enough to hear grit landing on the roof. Most of them walked out. 41,000 people did not sit in a transit hall and die. They went home. Because a man who has stood in a queue for 3 days and finally understood that there is no ship goes back to his own kitchen and shuts the door. The city emptied over the next week into the districts and the outer settlements and the pan crew barracks along the shallows. What was left at the port when the Vox Tower finally raised the departing authority for the last time was the people with nowhere in the city to go back to. Southern refugees, mostly, brine crews who had come up on the salt trains out of Ossenbright with what they could carry, port casuals, a lot of very old people, and 160 children from the port creche whose parents had gone up on the hulls in the medical rotation and who were now the property of nobody at all. The departing authority asked for a figure, standard practice. It goes in the return, and the return is the last document a withdrawing administration produces, and the only one anybody ever reads afterwards. Melcaster himself was not on the Vox. It was some warrant officer on a ship, reading his way down a form, and he asked how many souls remained at the port facility, and I stood in the booth and looked out through the glass at the pans and the concourse and the roofs of the freight sheds where people had begun to camp, and I gave him a number. I said 4,000. It was not 4,000. It was 4,031. I had no tally office left to hold the figure, and I have never been able to hold one myself. I looked at a crowd the way I had looked at crowds since I was 17, and I estimated, and I rounded down. A round-odd number sounds like a counted number and gets less argument on a bad Vox link. 31 people. 6 days is how long it took, and the thing that nearly killed us was not the alien. Vorlach sat on a salt sea. Every drop of drinking water in that city came out of the condenser farm on the North Ridge, and the condenser farm ran off the Port Authority reactor, and the Mechanicus had taken the reactor offline as part of the denial protocol, because a working plant is a gift to whoever arrives next. So the tanks in the freight sheds were what we had, and there were 4,000 of us, and the arithmetic on that was not difficult even for me. The armsmen took charge of the tanks on the first evening, which was correct, and by the third evening, 2 of them had decided that taking charge of a thing and owning it are the same verb. Warden Dovik Brent sorted that out with the men he still trusted in a loading bay without ceremony, and then he came and found me in the booth and sat down on the floor with his back against the console and said that he had just done something that was going to be difficult to explain to a magistrate. I told him there were no magistrates within 9 jumps and that he should get some sleep. Neither of us used the word. I kept the halls moving. It is genuinely all I know. The booth had emergency cells, and the low speakers on the floor still worked, so twice a day I put the port on a schedule, and I gave it out in exactly the voice I had used when there were ships. Water issue at the 6th bell, North Concourse, 1 vessel per household. Please bring your own vessel. Sanitation trench parties muster at Gate 9. The trench will be cut east to west, thank you. It sounds absurd. It was the difference between 4,000 people and 4,000 animals, and I knew it, and everyone in that port knew it, and nobody said so, because the whole trick stops working the moment it is said out loud. Ilka ran the floor with the handcaster and slept about 9 hours in 6 days, and got very quiet, which in her was the equivalent of screaming. On the 5th day, the children from the port creche started asking when the parents were coming. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a scheduling problem. 160 children with no adults attached to them will produce a specific and rising sound in an enclosed space, and if you do not put an instruction over that sound, you are going to have a stampede of 9-year-olds in a building full of open shafts. So I put a schedule on the children too. Lessons at the 2nd bell, catechism at the 4th, singing at the 7th. We kept the catechism on the schedule. Nobody proposed taking it off, including me. 2 of the old brine women from Ossenbright ran it. There was a girl of about 6 who used to come and stand under the roof speakers and look up at them, which the women told me was because she thought the voice lived up there. She was correct in every way that matters. The man behind the glass has stopped me twice this morning to change a spool, and both times he has apologized, and both times I have told him it does not matter, because I know exactly where I am in an account, and I can pick it up on the same breath. 9 years of being cut off mid-sentence by a klaxon will do that to a man. He has a sheet in front of him with a column of marks on it, and he fills it in while I talk, and the marks have nothing to do with what I am saying. I worked that out on the 2nd morning. He is measuring something else. The Tau came on the 6th day, and the first thing they did was talk. There was a drone over the port at dawn, very high, a smooth, dark shape that did not sound like anything, and it hung there for 2 hours while people got used to it. Then, at the 8th bell, every working speaker in the Port Authority came on at once. Not the roof speakers, all of them, including the ones in the sheds that had been dead for 11 years, which told anyone with sense that something had walked into our systems and made itself comfortable. And a voice came out of them in perfect low Gothic, better Gothic than mine, with the vowels of a hive world in the coreword passage. It said that a Tau force was 1 hour from the northern approach and that no weapons would be discharged unless weapons were discharged first. It said that they were aware there were 4,000 people at the facility, that they were aware of the water situation, and that they would like to speak to whoever the people here listen to. Whoever the people here listen to, not whoever is in charge. They had been watching us for at least a day, and they had worked out that the man with the gun and the badge was not the one who moved 4,000 people twice a day, and that the moving was being done by a voice in a roof. Warden Brent went out to the northern approach with 11 armsmen and their last guns slung, which I still think was brave. and I went with him because the voice had asked for me by function. There were 3 of them waiting on the road with 2 skimmers behind, and a human woman standing off to one side in a cut-down Tau tunic with an Imperial Aquila tattoo on her forearm that she had not bothered to have removed. 2 of the ones with guns were in that pale sand armor, tall, long-faced, standing entirely still in the way that a thing stands still when it does not need to look brave. The third was smaller and softer and unarmored, and wore a robe the color of wet slate, and he opened both hands, palms out, and introduced himself with a great many syllables of which I retained the last 2. Ruan, por ui Ruan, of Kiel Shan Sept, of the water caste. And he began to explain. He explained for nearly 40 minutes. He explained the concept of the greater good, and the situation in the southern brine belt, and the current disposition of the Panfield workforce at Ossenbright and their scrip arrangements, and the medical support available at his CP's forward holding. Our condensers could be brought back up in 9 days by his Earthcast, but not sooner, and 9 days was longer than our water, and he explained both of those twice. Therefore, the proposal, which was that we should be lifted out to a holding at a place 2,000 kilometers north, where there was water in the ground. He explained the airframes. He explained the loading rates. He explained twice that nobody would be compelled, that any person who wished to remain would be left with a fair share of the water. And he meant it, which I could tell because he kept coming back to it in a slightly anxious way, like a man who has been told his people have a reputation and is determined to correct it in one afternoon. I let him finish. Then I asked him 3 questions. How many can you lift in a day? Where exactly are you putting us? And who feeds 4,000 people when we get there? He answered all 3 immediately and precisely and without a single decorative word. And that is when I decided the thing was real, since a liar decorates. Then I told him that he should not, under any circumstances, say any of that to the crowd. He did not understand. His human Marla Hessig understood, and I watched her work it out and go gray around the mouth. But Ruan genuinely did not, and he asked me why, and I said the sentence I have said perhaps 200 times in my career, and never once to a Xenos. I said, people do not need to be convinced. They need to be told where to stand. He looked at me for a while. He had eyes with no whites to speak of, and it is very hard to know what is happening behind them. Then he said, "That is a sorrow," and I said, "That is a cue." And we understood each other from that point onward well enough to save 4,000 lives. The Tau did not trick us. There was no drug in the water, no hypnotic broadcast, no honeyed lie. There was a very polite person in a wet slate robe who had done his arithmetic properly, and a fleet of airframes that arrived when he said they would, and a landing ground marked out in luminous cord, and a medical station standing up before the first lift went out. What they did to us was competence. After 6 days of a dead port and 11 weeks of a schedule that put a crate of primer salts above my neighbors, competence was the most seductive sight any of us had ever had, and it did not need a single lie in it. They lifted us in 4 days. Their big airframes are called Orcas, and they hold about 140 people if you pack them the way I packed them, and they came in on a rotation of 6 with the bigger thing standing off at altitude that Hessig told me was a manta, and I have no way of knowing whether she was right or whether that was simply the largest word she had, and every one of those aircraft arrived within a minute of when Ruan said it would. I called the loading from a Tau field speaker on a pole, which had better tone than anything the Port Authority had ever bought me. Gate is now the North Chord. North Chord walk on. First 140 from the marked ground. Walk on. The intervals may lengthen, that is normal. Nobody is late. Not one person was crushed. Not one child was separated. 4,031 people went up off a salt pan in the dark in 4 days, in good order, in a straight line into the machines of the enemy of mankind, and they went the way they went because a man in the roof of a building had spent 9 years teaching them that the voice tells the truth about where to stand. The last lift went out with me, Ilka, Warden Brennant, the 2 brine women, and about 60 of the creche children. I was the last human being to leave Vorlach. Ruan waited for me at the cord and stood aside so I could go up the ramp first, and I did not thank him, and he did not seem to expect it, and behind us the port sat empty in the dark with its stack down and its water gone, and its roof speakers still live and hissing very faintly because I had not turned them off. They called the place we went to Fioshala, which I never learned to say properly, and which the Earthcast supervisor told me meant something close to the working ground. We called it the Grant, because on the second morning a Tau, in a mustard-colored suit, came down the line with a slate and granted every household a numbered plot of 40 paces by 20. And Sundrach people had a word for land you were given and did not own, and that word was a grant. It was 2,000 kilometers north of Vorlach on the edge of the Sink country, and the reason they had chosen it was water. Not condensers. Water in the ground at 9 meters, sweet enough to drink without treatment, in a country where the sky was the same bad yellow as everywhere else on that planet, but where the wind came off the Sink flats instead of off the brine. The Earthcast had put up 90 long sheds before we arrived, prefabricated. All of them identical, all of them the right size, all of them standing on leveled ground with drainage cut. 90 sheds, and not one of them was the wrong size. It took some of the older people a fortnight to stop walking the line and checking. I walked the whole line of them on the first evening counting sheds, which for me is a considerable undertaking, and I remember standing at the end of the 90th one and thinking about the 9 years I had spent asking the Port Authority for a new floor drain in the Western Concourse. They put me in a shed at the north end with the 2 brine women and 40 other people, and on the second day Ruan came and found me and asked me very politely to give him 4,000 names. The Tau are not slack about records. The Earthcast had counted us as we came off the ramps at the far end, an actual head count, machine-assisted, and they had our number to the person, and what they wanted from me was not a count, but a register. Names against faces against plot numbers, for rations, for the medical station, for schooling, for the whole apparatus of a people who genuinely intend to keep you alive for a long time. Their machine could hear Gothic well enough, but it could not hear Salt World Gothic spoken by a 70-year-old brine woman with 4 teeth, and it kept producing nonsense. And so they needed a human voice with clean diction to repeat each name into the recorder after the person said it. So I stood at a table in the open for 4 days with Ruan on one side and a mustard-colored Earthcast adept on the other, and 4,000 of my neighbors walking past me in a queue that I had organized myself, and I said their names, slowly, clearly, one at a time in the voice. Hanna Vosterlin, plot 412. Anders Vosterlin, plot 412. Paratilms, plot 413. 4 days of that. It is the longest continuous piece of speaking I have ever done, and my throat was ruined for a fortnight, and I would do it again because at the end of it, 4,000 people had ration cards and beds and a doctor. On the 4th evening, near the end of the line, I came to the ones with no papers. There were 31 of them, southern refugees mostly, brine crews who had come up out of Ossenbright ahead of the fighting, plus a few port casuals who had been living in the sheds at Vorlach for years without ever appearing in anybody's book. No identity slates. No tithe numbers. Some of them had never had one, and some had thrown theirs away on the road for reasons I did not ask about. And when I asked for names, several of them gave me names I knew perfectly well were not theirs, because I had heard other people call them something else during 6 days at the port. One of them was a young man everybody called Torv, who was deaf on his left side from standing next to a pan boiler when it let go, and who laughed at his own jokes about a second before the end of them, and who had carried water for the whole northern shed for 6 days without being asked. When I asked Torv his family name, he thought about it for slightly too long and then offered me one. I stopped the recorder. Understand what I was looking at. A Xenos register with names in it, taken down by machine. Sooner or later, on some scale of years, that register would be read by the Imperium, because everything is eventually read by the Imperium, and a false name in it, put there by a man with no slate, is not a small thing when the reading is done. I have never in my life been able to hold a number in my head, but I could always see a queue 2 hours ahead of where it was standing, and what I saw was 31 people with an invented name in an alien record and no papers to defend it with. So I made a decision, quickly, the way I made every decision I ever made in that booth, and I turned to the Earthcast Adept, and I told him that the register was complete. 4,000. Exactly the number I had given the departing authority. A round number, clean. Matching the count I had already spoken aloud once, which was the only number about that port that anybody in the Imperium had ever written down. Ruan asked whether these people would need cards. I said they were attached to households and would draw with them. He accepted that without argument, since it was administratively true, and since he was a person who assumed that a man who had just spent 4 days reading names to keep his neighbors fed was not going to lie to him about the last 31. He was right. I was not lying to him. I was lying to somebody who had not arrived yet. Those 31 people lived 3 years at the Grant on other people's ration cards. Nobody in that settlement ever once suggested it should be otherwise. Torv hauled water. He was the best worker in the northern sheds, and he did not exist. And if you had asked me at any time in those 3 years whether I had done him a service or a harm, I would have said service, and I would have said it without pausing, and I would have gone back to whatever I was doing. There was informing. People went to the Watercast about their neighbors over plot boundaries and ration cards, and in one case, that ran for most of a summer, a dog. There was a man in Shed 60 who reported 4 separate households in the first year for things he had invented outright. What the Tau did with every one of those was investigated, patiently, and then move the boundary or issue the extra card or, in the matter of the dog, take a statement from everybody in the shed. Nobody was taken away. Nobody was made an example of. Informing on your neighbors to the Tau got you a hearing and a decision, and after about 18 months, people mostly stopped because there was no profit in it. 2 men were killed in the 2nd year over a woman. The Tau did not leave that to us either. They investigated it exactly the way they had investigated the dog, and at the end of it, the man who had done it was taken off the Grant and put to work somewhere else on that planet, and we were never told where, and he did not come back. People were angrier about that than they had been about the killing. There was nothing to watch and nothing to settle, and no end to it that anybody could stand at the edge of, and a settlement wants an end it can stand at the edge of. Those 2 were the only blood spilled at the Grant in 3 years that was not the fevers. The 3 years were good. We farmed. Salt World people who had spent 9 generations boiling brine were shown how to put seed in ground, and it grew under a yellow sky in the Sink country. Since the Earthcast had gone into the soil and done something to it that I am not qualified to describe. There was a medical station with a Xenos doctor and 2 human orderlies, and it was open at night. There was a school in Shed 41, where the creche children learned reading and figures and a certain amount about the greater good. There was work and there was food, and nobody was beaten for the pace of their work. Nobody was stopped from walking off the grant either, in 3 years, and hardly anybody tried it, because a ration card was cut against a plot number, and the Southern Belt was under the same administration, and would have wanted to know where that card had come from. Once a month, the water caste functionary came round the sheds and asked people what was wrong, and then, and this is the part that broke more of us than anything else they did, fixed it. They wanted things in return. Anyone who tells you the Tao ask nothing is selling something. They wanted labor, and they got it. They wanted quiet, and they got it. They wanted volunteers for the human auxiliaries, the Gue Vesa, and they got about 300 over 3 years, mostly young, mostly from the sheds where the fighting in the South had taken somebody's family. For most of them, the undertaking meant labor and liaison in the sink country, and they slept in their own plots and ate at their own tables and were still doing exactly that on the morning the Imperium walked in. About 60 went to fighting units away from the settlement. Warden Dovich Brent took the undertaking in the first winter. He came and told me himself, standing in my doorway with his cap in his hands, like a man confessing to a marriage. And he said that he had killed 2 Imperial subjects in a loading bay at Vorlach, and that no magistrate was ever coming, and that a man has to be under something. I told him I hoped it fit better than the last one. He laughed and went away, and I did not see him for months at a time after that. And he was killed eventually in the 2nd year on some other part of the planet, doing something for them, and they sent his effects up to the grant in a sealed box, with a note in Gothic explaining the circumstances, which is more than the Munitorum ever did for anybody I knew. They sent the body as well. He went into the burial ground with a marker like everyone else, and that is the only reason his name could be answered at the line 18 months later by a woman who had never met him. What we kept was a different account, and the man who kept it was Joram Falk of Shed 12, a boiler foreman off the Southern Pans, who had never in his life been asked to do anything except watch a pressure gauge. No preacher had stayed at Vorlach. The ecclesiarchy had gone up on the hulls with the tithe records and the relics, which was correct, and which was in the schedule. So in the 2nd week at the grant, Falk began saying the evening office in the open ground between sheds 11 and 12, out of his own head, from whatever he could remember of it. He got parts of it wrong for 3 years, and nobody ever corrected him, because nobody out there knew any better either. 40 people at the start. The better part of 600 by the 2nd winter, which is twice what the recruiters ever got, and I never once heard anybody make that comparison out loud. Ruan offered him a shed for it. A whole one, with a floor and a stove. Falk turned it down and came and told me why, standing in my doorway with his arms at his sides like a man at a muster. And what he said was that a thing you are given by the alien is not a thing you have kept from him. He said it without any heat at all. He was the least heated man I have ever met. And he kept a book. Names, dates, who came and who did not, in a hand like bent wire. He kept it because he intended to hand it over. He told me that when our own came back, there would be questions about what people had done out here, and that somebody ought to be able to answer them properly, with a document, rather than with everybody shouting about their neighbors. I looked at that book once. It was good work, better ordered than anything the Port Authority produced in my 9 years. And I told him so and thought no more about it, because at that time I believed exactly the same thing he did. One of their priests came once, in the 2nd summer. An their word for it is ethereal, and the sept people around him, behaved in a way I had never seen a soldier behave. And he stood on a cargo pallet in the middle of the grant and spoke for 11 minutes about the future through a translator he did not need, and 4,000 people stood in the open in the heat and listened to him without shifting their feet. That is the only time in 3 years I was frightened. Not of him, of the work. I stood at the back with my arms folded, and I listened to a voice do to a crowd exactly what I had spent 9 years learning to do to a crowd, and do it better, and do it in a language that half of them did not speak. I know my own trade when I hear it. The pauses were in the right places. The pitch came down at the end of every third sentence, which is what tells people the matter is settled. When he finished, 4,000 people who had been abandoned by their own species applauded an alien priest in the middle of a field, and I applauded too, because I was standing in the open and I am not a stupid man. The sink fever took 233 of us over the 3 years. It came out of the groundwater or the dust, and their doctor could not stop it and said so in those words. It took mostly the old and 10 of the creche children, which Ilka did not once speak about in 3 years. 5 of the 31 went with it, including one of the port casuals, and those 5 went into the burial ground with the rest and had markers cut with the names they had given us, whatever those were worth. And 161 children were born at the grant in 3 years. Every one of them was entered in the Earth Caste Register on the day of the birth, with the plot number and the parents and the hour, because the Tau are not slack about records. It never once occurred to any of us that a birth could be a dangerous thing to write down. The fever took 9 of those babies too in the second winter, and their names went on the markers with the rest, and that was the first time I saw the Earth Caste Adept look like anything at all. In the middle of the second year, Ruan came to me with a proposal. He wanted the reading again. The register I had spoken into the machine at the table, the 4,000 names, only done properly this time. Clean audio, no cue noise, no wind, no 70-year-old brine women coughing into the pickup. He said it was for the record. He said that the record of Vorlok was going to be read in 14 systems, and that it should be read well. And then, because he was a water caste functionary and lying to me had never once occurred to him, he told me exactly what it was for. It was going to go out over their broadcast. 4,000 Imperial subjects, abandoned at a port by their own authorities, under a written schedule that put ammunition primer above children, lifted out by the Tau, alive, farmed, schooled, doctored, 3 years on, names read by one of their own. Proof, in a human voice, in low Gothic, that the greater good is not a slogan. I said no on the first day. I said no because it felt like being asked to sing at a rival house. Then I said what it would cost. A second well at the south end of the grant because the sheds down there were carrying water 400 paces. Roofing for 60 and 61, which had been patched with cargo sheet since the first winter. And a proper room at the medical station for the births with a door on it, because up to then, women had been delivering in a curtained corner of a ward full of fever cases. Ruan wrote all 3 down and had all 3 before the end of the month. And then I sat in a quiet room in a machine-built shed for 11 hours over 2 days and read 4,000 names into an alien recorder in the best voice I have ever produced in my life. And it was the best. I had 3 years of groundwater and regular food in me and no crowd screaming under the booth. And I gave every one of those 4,000 names its own weight, the way you do it when the name is the only thing a person is going to get. I put the pauses in the right places. I brought the pitch down at the end of every third name so that a listener would not drift. Hanna Vosterlin, Anders Vosterlin, Perret Ilms, 11 hours. When I finished, the Earthcast technicians stood up and did the thing they do with their hands, and Ruan told me it was the finest piece of work of its kind ever produced in that September, and I believed him, and I went back to my shed and slept for a day and a half, and thought no more about it than a man thinks about a good day at his trade. It went out over the passage for 18 months, in 14 systems, read by me. Ilka taught in Shed 41, all 3 years. The creche children were her particular business, the 160 who had come off the ramps with nobody attached to them, and she had a way of running a room full of children that was exactly the same trade as ours, only slowed down. She told me once that teaching was just calling with fewer people and worse acoustics. In the third summer, she was 25 years old and could have had any plot and any household in the grant. And instead, she had a school with 160 children in it. And she used to sit on the step outside it in the evening with her boots up on a water drum, eating whatever the sink country had instead of salt biscuits, which was a hard gray root you had to boil twice. She said one thing to me that I have kept. We were sitting on that step in the third summer, watching the yellow go out of the sky, and she said, "Do you ever think it is strange that they saved us and nobody has come?" And I said that it was not strange, that we were 4,000 people on a schedule that had us below the primer salts, and that the arithmetic had not changed. And she said, "Then why do I keep listening for ships?" I did not have an answer for that, and I did not attempt one. The ships came in the third autumn. The Tau knew 4 days before we did. Their air movement changed, which anyone could see, and the Sept people at the Grant went from unhurried to merely calm, which in them is a considerable difference. Ruan came up on the third day and did the thing I had spent 3 years watching him do, which is that he began to explain. He got as far as saying that the fleet was Imperial and that the disposition of the northern sink country could not be held. And then he started on what would happen to us afterwards, and I told him to stop. I did not tell him gently. I told him to stop talking, and I told him that whatever he had been briefed to say about the Ordos and the recovery of Xenos-held populations was a thing his people said about my people because it suited them to say it, and that I had lived my entire life inside the Imperium and knew what it was and did not need a Xenos to describe my own house to me. He listened to all of it. Then he said very quietly that he would not explain any further. He said, "I will tell you where to stand instead. Stand on the ramp. Come north with us, and bring anyone who will come, and there will be ground for you." The offer went to the sworn first, and Ruan did that properly, and I stood at the back of the ground and watched him do it. What he had said to me on my own step the evening before, and what was standing on the ground in the morning were not the same offer, and the difference was not dishonesty. It was a withdrawal being compressed from 4 days into 2 by somebody a long way above him, which is a thing that happens to every army there has ever been. There was one airframe down with a hard number on it. The number covered the person who had taken the undertaking and did not cover that person's household, because a withdrawal is not a lift, and the watercast does not invent capacity. It has not got. He stood in front of 240 people and told them exactly that, in Gothic, twice, so that nobody could say afterwards that they had misheard it. 19 went. Every one of them came out of a household where everybody in it had already taken the undertaking, so there was nobody left standing on the ground behind them. The other 221 stayed where they were, and I have never once heard any of them called a fool for it, and I have been in rooms since where people were hunting for somebody to call one. The rest of us stood in the open and watched the airframes go, and the last thing Ruan did was hand me a slate copy of the settlement register, 3 years of it, births and deaths and plots and rations. The Earthcast had spent the night before, pulling the cores out of their own cogitators and loading them onto the airframes, so what he put into my hands was the last copy of the grant left anywhere on that planet. He knew what else it was. It is a list of 4,000 people who ate Xeno's rations for 3 years, with a plot number against every name, and he had been watching the Imperium work for longer than I had. He gave it to me anyway. What he said was that a population which is written down is harder to make disappear than a population which is not. And he had that precisely backwards, and he was not being stupid when he said it. He had simply never met the administratum. Then he went up the ramp. He did not thank me for the reading, and I did not thank him for the 3 years, and we understood each other well enough at the end that neither of those omissions meant anything. I stayed. I was not compelled to stay. I was not persuaded to stay. And I did not stay out of loyalty to a throne I had watched write my neighbors in below a crate of salt. I stayed because Ilka was not going to leave 150 children in a school, and the children were not going anywhere, and the old women were not going anywhere, and because when I turned it over in my head at the speed I turned things over, which is fast, I came out with the wrong answer for a reason that was entirely my own. I thought in numbers of people, which is the only way I have ever known how to think. 4,000 is not a figure you do anything quick with. 4,000 has to be fed while you are deciding about it, and housed, and then moved, and moving 4,000 people takes hulls. And hulls were the commodities Sundrach had never once been given enough of. So I worked out that we would be counted and retithed and put back on a panfield within the year. Every step of that reasoning was sound. I could not find the crime either. There was no crime. It turned out not to be the sort of thing that needed one. We had been abandoned. We had been picked up. We had eaten and worked and buried our dead and had our children, and now our own were coming, and I was the man who had kept 4,000 people alive and in order for 6 days at a dead port and 3 years in a field. And if there was a hearing, then I proposed to attend it and speak, because speaking is what I am for. There were 11 days between the last airframe going up and the first Imperial boot coming down, with no wire on that settlement and nobody in charge of it except me. And it would be a lie to say that 4,000 people sat in their plots and waited. Somewhere between 40 and 60 walked out, mostly sworn, which is who you would expect. There is one road out of the Sink country. It runs south, and it is 4 days on foot to anything at all. The Vestrand picked up almost every one of them on that road inside a week, and walked them back to their own plots without a mark on any of them, because a recovered population is counted where it is found, and a man on a road is an administrative nuisance and not a crime. 2 were found dead out on the flats about 9 kilometers down, and both went on to the count as deaths at the settlement, because there is no line on the form for a man who dies on a road. Everybody else in those 90 sheds had the matter explained to them by the sight of the rest being walked back in through their own gate. That is why nobody ran later. It had already been tried in front of everybody a fortnight before I made the first call. The militarum came into the grant on foot at first light 11 days later. The Vestrand 61st, raised on a world I had never heard of, in dust-colored fatigues, and they came in the way you come into a place you have been told about, rather than the way you come into a place you are freeing. Nobody shot at anybody. The whole thing took 40 minutes. They put a cordon around the 90 sheds, and they told us to remain in our plots, and they were not rough about it. And by mid-morning there were vehicles coming up the Sink Road all day, and by evening there was wire. Not around the settlement. Around each block of 10 sheds. wire on the inside as well as the outside, which means the people laying it expect to be sorting rather than holding. They fed us. Worth saying, since for 6 days everybody in those sheds walked around telling each other that the food proved everything was going to be all right. Munitorum ration crates, opened and issued at the sheds twice a day by young men who would not meet anyone's eye and who had been ordered not to speak to us and mostly obeyed. There was a medici tent with a queue outside it every morning, which was the first time in 3 years any of us had needed to queue for a doctor. Several people remarked on it. A commissar walked the wire twice a day and did nothing at all. And nobody in 6 days told 4,000 people anything whatsoever, which for a man in my trade was the loudest signal available. The only queue you keep quiet is the one you do not want moving on its own. On the 7th day, they opened a processing shed at the north end and began calling people through it, and the first name they called was mine. The shed had been the Earthcast's tool store, and they had cleared it and put a table across it and hung an Aquila banner on the end wall, which struck me as an odd thing to freight 2,000 kilometers up a sink road. There was a servo skull at the ceiling. There were 2 adepts at a side desk with a cogitator between them. There was a man in a brown coat and a great deal of brass at his collar who never spoke, and whose name I learned later was Grell, and who did nothing for 11 days except make marks on a schedule. He ate at the 11th bell every one of those days, out of a flat tin, standing up, facing the door, and he was done in about 4 minutes. I never saw what was in the tin, and I never once saw him offer any of it to anybody, or take any of anybody else's. And there was Interrogator Vesaquist, who was about 50, small, dressed in gray with reading lenses on a chain, and a way of sitting down that suggested a woman settling into a long piece of work she expected to do properly. No rack, no whip, no shouting. In 11 days, I never heard her raise her voice, and I would know because I would have heard the technique in it. She began by playing me a recording. It came out of a Vox horn on the table, and it was clean audio, no wind, no cue noise, and it was me. 11 hours of me, cut down to about 4 minutes. Hanna Vosterlin, Anders Vosterlin, Peret Ilms. My own pauses, my own downward turn on every third name. She let it run for the whole 4 minutes and watched me listen to it, and then she turned it off and said that it had been monitored in 14 systems for 18 months, and that copies had been recovered from a cult cell on a world I had never been to, where it had been played at meetings. Then she asked me if the voice was mine, and I said it was, because it was, and because a man who denies his own voice to a woman holding a recording of it has already told her everything about himself. For 6 days she asked me about logistics. That is the part nobody believes. I had braced myself for the alien and the lie, for questions about the priest on the pallet, for whether I had prayed, and instead she wanted the intervals of the food issue, the composition of the medical station, the layout of the plots, the schooling hours, the seed strains the Earthcast had put in the sink ground, and how many of us had gone into the auxiliaries and by what recruitment method. She wanted to know how the Tau had moved 4,000 people in 4 days without a crush. I told her, in detail, gladly, professionally, because it was 4 days of the cleanest movement I was ever part of, and because I am a tradesman, and she was the first person in 3 years who had asked me a technical question. I gave her the chits on the 3rd day because I thought they were worth something. 2 Port Authority staff seats, grade 4, reserved, signed off by a prefect and never used, and I had carried both of them through 3 years in a tin, being the sort of man who keeps a docket. I put them on the table in front of her the way you put down a good hand. She looked at them for a moment and passed them to one of the adepts, and the adept entered them, and she told me that an issued seat which is not taken is a lift movement carried on a manifest and not performed, and that this constituted a discrepancy in the withdrawal accounts, and that it would be noted. That is what my chits were, 2 units of unused capacity in somebody else's return. On the 4th day, I gave her the register. Nobody asked me for it. Rouen had put a slate copy of the settlement record in my hands on the ramp, and had told me that a record is a defense, and I had spent 6 days behind wire watching young men refuse to meet anybody's eye, and I concluded quickly, in the way that I have always concluded things, that the fastest route out of that shed was to hand the Imperium a complete and honest account of 3 years. Every plot, every ration issue, every death with cause, every birth with the hour and the parents and the plot number, 161 of them, 9 crossed through for the fever. All of it in the Earthcast's own notation, with our names put through their machine going in, which I did not give a second thought to while I was handing it across the table. She thanked me. She said it was a considerable help. That is the only gratitude I have ever had from the Holy Ordos. On the 7th day, she told me we were dead. She did it without any preparation at all, which I took at the time for a kindness of a particular institutional sort. She had a document on the table, an original with the seals still on it, and she turned it round so I could read it. A Munitorum casualty return, filed 3 years and 1 month earlier out of the withdrawal from Vorlach. It said that the port facility had been lost with all souls remaining, and the number written in the box was 4,000. The signature at the bottom was Duran Melcaster, Prefect, Port Authority, Vorlach, and beside it was the countersignature of a warrant officer I had spoken to for 90 seconds on a bad Vox link about a figure. I said, "That is an error, and it can be corrected." She said, "It can." That is exactly what she said. Not a denial. She took her lenses off and she explained to me in about 20 minutes, at a pace I could follow, precisely what correcting it would cost, and I am going to give it to you the way she gave it to me, because there is no version of this that is improved by my summarizing it. A return is not a statement about people. It is an instrument. The Vorlach return had gone up into the theater consolidation for the withdrawal from the inner passage, and the consolidation was the basis of the finding that the withdrawal was conducted in good order, which was signed off and closed and commended. The 4,000 had been carried into the loss certification for the Sundrach levy district, and against that certification the administratum had granted an abatement on 3 years of reagent salt tithe, which had been consumed in primers in a war that was still going on. The war pensions of 4,000 households had been assessed and paid out to the families who had lifted out. Property had been reassessed and reassigned. Dependents had been resolved. 11 marriages had been contracted on the strength of it, and there were children of those marriages. To make us alive again, she said, all of that has to be unmade. The abatement is void, and a district that has been under Xenos occupation for 3 years is invoiced for 3 years of arrears. 4,000 pensions become recoverable debts against families who have already spent them, which the administratum will pursue. 11 marriages become void, and the children of them become unregistered, and unregistered persons on a reconquered world are dealt with by a process you have already seen the beginning of. And the finding at Vorlach stops reading lost to enemy action, and starts reading abandoned with a live population, and that finding has names attached to it, at the Port Authority, at the fleet, at the theater staff. Then she put her lenses back on. She said, "The cost of 4,000 people being alive is paid by rather more than 4,000 people, and none of them are in this shed. I asked about Bright. I asked on the 7th day, before anything had happened to anybody. I said that there were 4 million people in the southern brine belt who had worked 3 years under the same flag we had, who had taken the same scrip, whose children had sat in the same schools. I said that the Munitorum ration crates the Vestrand men had been issuing to us behind the wire carried an Bright Works stamp, burned into the end board. So I knew perfectly well that the southern pan fields were lit again and already back at work under the Imperium. And I asked her what the difference was between them and us. She answered immediately, without any pleasure in it at all. She said, "Nobody filed a return on them. That is the whole of it. 4 million people on that planet lived under the alien for 3 years and were retithed and put back to work, and are boiling brine on Sundrach as I speak. 4,000 lived under the alien for 3 years and were written down as dead by a tired warrant officer on a bad link because a man in a booth rounded a number. I asked her why she was telling me any of it. Not why us, and not how can you. Why the 20 minutes, because 20 minutes of an interrogator's time is a decision somebody made on purpose. She said that she had read my file before she opened the return, and that she had known since the 2nd day that I was going to be of use to her, and that a man who understands an instrument works it better than a man who believes he is being murdered. She said she had seen both, and that the difference between them was about a week and a great deal of shooting. She was not being kind to me. She was warming a machine before putting a load on it in the correct order, the way anybody would. They had sent a confessor for the other question. He came up the Sink Road with 2 lay brothers and a portable shrine on a handcart, worked the sheds for a week, and sat with me for 2 hours because I was the voice, and the voice goes first. He wanted to know what had been taught out there and who had taught it. He heard the evening office said in the open ground beside shed 12 by 600 people who had been getting half the words wrong for 3 years, and when he was done, he certified the population and went back down the road. I never learned his name. He was not unkind, and he was not a fool, and what he wrote was that the faith of the grant was intact and irregular. The office itself went into the finding as an unsanctioned rite requiring correction, with a course of recatechization to begin in the spring, and Joram Falk named in it as the man who would have to be corrected first. None of that happened. It was overtaken. She told me the rest of it in the same flat, unhurried voice, and I recognized the technique because it was mine. The examination for Xenos influence had been carried out over those 7 days by means she did not describe, and the finding was that there was nothing of consequence in us. No taint, no compulsion, no seated doctrine beyond the ordinary sort that any preacher of any creed leaves in a child. She said that if the file had turned on that question, we would all have been on a transport to a resettlement world within the month. Then she said, "The file does not turn on that question. The file turns on the return. The return is correct, and a correct document is not something the Imperium of man sets aside for the convenience of the people it happens to describe. The man behind the glass has put his hand up, and I have stopped, because he is changing something in the rack and does not want the noise of it on the recording. While he does it, he has told me, unprompted, that I have a very clear delivery, and that most of the people he records swallow the ends of their words. I thanked him. In 6 hours, he has not asked me one question about any of what I have described, and I do not believe that is discipline. I think none of it reaches him. 2 days after she told me we were dead, the man in the brown coat spoke for the first time. Adept Grell had a voice like a drawer closing, and he read from a schedule, and the order he read it in is what happened to us. The instrument, he said, was a bill of correction against a return of 4,000 souls. A return is a count, and a count cannot be executed. An execution requires a schedule of persons, and the schedule of persons, he said, had been authenticated from an enemy broadcast monitored in 14 systems over 18 months, comprising 4,000 names in sequence, read in Low Gothic by a subject present at this facility. He read the provenance, too, because provenance is the first line of any instrument. The bill had been drawn at the sector on the finding of an inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, whose name I heard exactly once, in that shed, and never again, and who was not on Sundrach, and had never been on Sundrach, and did not come. Interrogator Quist held it for execution. That is what an interrogator is for. There was nobody inside 9 jumps of that table who had decided anything, and there was nobody to ask. That is when I understood what I had done in 11 hours in a quiet room for a well and some roofing and a door on a birthing room. The return had a number in a box and nothing else. No names. Nobody at Vorlach was writing anything down by then, and a number in a box cannot be lined up against faces. Ruan had wanted the reading done properly so that 4,000 abandoned people would be more than a figure in somebody's file, and I had done it properly, with a pause in the right place for every one of them. 4,000 names in sequence, clean audio, monitored, authenticated, time-stamped. The kindest act of the Tau Empire on the planet Sundrach, and the finest work of my professional life. And between them they were the warrant. Then Greller read the tally. Named persons on the schedule, 4,000. Named persons deceased at the settlement, 219. Named persons removed by the enemy on withdrawal, 19. Named persons present and living, 3,762. Persons present at the settlement not appearing on the schedule, 178, comprising 26 adults without record, and 152 children born at the settlement, of whom the parentage and hour of birth were established from a register voluntarily surrendered by a subject at this facility. Shortfall against the schedule, 238. There was no column for the undertaking. I looked for one while he was reading. 240 people in that settlement had put their hand to an alien oath, and most of them were still drawing rations under it on the morning the Vestrand 61st walked in. Joram Falk had 600 at the evening office beside Shed 12, and had turned down a roof for it from the people who were feeding him. The schedule did not separate any of them by so much as a mark. I did not ask Grelle about that. Somebody did later, and I was standing next to him when he got his answer. I said, "There is no shortfall. 219 of those people are in the burial ground 400 paces from this shed, and there are markers on them with the dates cut in, and 19 more went north on an alien ship. And you have both facts written down in front of you in a hand you have already called reliable." Grelle explained the difficulty without looking up. A schedule is answered by persons, not by markers. Each name on the schedule must be called and answered and closed. A name that cannot be answered leaves the instrument open, and an open instrument returns to the sector, and a returned instrument reopens the return, and reopening the return brings you back to what the interrogator had already described to me at length. Therefore, the schedule would be answered in full. Therefore, the 178 persons present who were not on the schedule would be entered against names on the schedule that could not otherwise be answered. Therefore, the 26 adults without record and the 152 children born in the Sink country would go into the line under the names of dead brine workers, dead old women, dead pan crews, and a boy of 2 years old born in a shed on a Tuesday would answer to a name cut on a marker 400 paces away. That left 60. Grella said the balance would be made up by requisition from the labor pools at Ossenbright, and that transport had been arranged. I did not say anything for a while, and then I made the only protest of my life. I said that the people at Ossenbright had never been at Vorlach. Not one of them. They had never stood in my halls. They had never gone up a Tau ramp. They were on nobody's schedule and in nobody's return, and they were at that moment boiling salt for the Imperium 4,000 kilometers away, and there was no document on that table with their names in it. Grella said, "Correct. That is why they are available." Interrogator Quist let that sit for a moment, and then she told me two things in the order that a careful person puts things. The first was that I would not be shot. She said it before she asked me for anything, deliberately, and she said why, and there was nothing warm in it. The schedule required 4,000 answered names, and my name was on the schedule and would be answered by somebody, and the Ordo had a use for the voice that had been read in 14 systems for 18 months. A voice which has been an instrument of the enemy is an asset once it has been recovered. Those were her words, and the word she used for me was retained. She did not offer this in exchange for anything. She simply removed it from the table before we began, so that whatever I said next would not be a purchase. Grella made a mark on his sheet while she was speaking, and the balance to be requisitioned from Ossenbright went from 60 to 61, because a name whose owner does not answer it has to be answered by somebody else, and every somebody else in that settlement was already spoken for. He did not look up while he did it. The second thing was the request. 4,000 persons, a cut trench on the sink flats 11 kilometers out, and 11 days. She was entirely open about the alternative. It could be done with cordons and dogs and the Vestrand 61st, and a great deal of shooting into crowds. It would take 3 weeks and be filthy, and some hundreds would break out into the sink country and be hunted for a month. Soldiers who fire into a running mass of civilians are not usable afterwards for anything else in that theater. Children would be trampled at the wire, which she noted was a poor outcome for everyone, including the children. Or, she said, the queues could be called. I said yes on the same day, not after a night of it, in that shed within about 2 minutes. Not to live. She had given me that before she asked. I said yes because I could see the other version of it, which was 4,000 people I had fed and schooled and buried, running in the dark across sink flats with dogs behind them, children going down under boots at a wire gate, 800 or 900 dying badly over a month, in a way that would be described afterwards as regrettable. That is the reason. Then I made my one request, and I made it in the same conversation, in the same voice, because you ask for the thing while the other party is still saying yes. I asked for Ilka Danneborg. Quist did not refuse. That is the part people expect, and it did not happen. She turned to Grella, and Grella said that the name Danneborg appeared on the schedule and would be answered, and that if the person Danneborg was to be retained, then the name required a substitute from the unscheduled, and that the substitution would reduce the pool available against the other unanswered names by 1, and the requisition from Ossenbright would rise from 61 to 62. He wrote it down. It took him 9 seconds, and there was no more weight in it than in any other line he wrote that morning. And then he raised the other one in the same tone, because it was next on his sheet. The name Vrooten also appeared on the schedule and also required answering. He said that the substitute would have to be instructed to respond to the name when it was called, since a name unanswered at the line halts the count, and he asked whether I had a preference. I gave them Torv. I did it in about 4 seconds. Torv of the Northern Sheds, no family name that anyone could confirm, deaf on his left side, who had hauled water for 400 people for 6 days at the port without being asked, and who was the man the whole north end of the Grant followed to the water queue every morning without ever noticing they were following him. I gave him my name because you put your best man at the front of a line. That is the trade. The first man through a gate sets the pace for everyone behind him, and if the first man goes steady, 900 people go steady, and if the first man balks, you lose the haul. He knew what he was agreeing to. He was one of the 26, and he was going into the line under somebody's name no matter what happened, because Grella had settled that 2 days earlier, and the only open question left was whose. It cost him nothing, and I knew it cost him nothing when I said his name. He asked me one thing. He asked whether I would be walking out there as well, under whatever name they found for me. I told him no. He thought about that for a moment, and then he said it was a pity, because he had been looking forward to hearing me called. I spent the evening of the 10th day teaching a man to answer to my name. He got it in about an hour. He was not slow, he was deaf on one side, and he made a joke about it before I finished explaining, and laughed at the joke slightly before the end of it, and I stood in that shed and listened to Kolm Vrooten laughing in somebody else's mouth. The site was 11 kilometers out on the sink flats where the ground goes pale, and there is nothing standing higher than your knee in any direction. The Veystrand pioneers cut the trench with a machine in a day and a half, 260 meters of it, and the requisition draft from Ossenbright moved the spoil and spread lime and were trucked out at first light and back at dusk, and housed in a compound of their own beside the assembly ground, and they were told they were a works detail. They were a works detail for about 4 hours. After the first morning, there was nothing left to tell them, and nobody bothered to try, and they went on spreading lime for 9 days, with the trucks going out at first light and coming back at dusk. 11 kilometers is too far to walk 360 people out and bring the escort back twice in a day, and the Veystrand had not freighted enough water up the Sink Road to try it, so there were transports standing at the cord. 6 flatbeds, the sort the Munitorum moves crates on, with the sides up and the tailgates down. That is where it could have come apart on any of the 11 days and never did. People who have been walked to a vehicle in good order get onto the vehicle. The 400 paces are the hard part. I worked from a mast at the assembly ground with a hand caster for the line itself, and I set it up the way I would have set up a shift change, because it is the only architecture I know. Households together, named order by plot number, north end first, which meant my own shed went in the first 2 days, and which I did on purpose so that nobody could say the caller had put his own neighbors at the back. 440 on the first day, then a steady 360, then more towards the end as the pace settled, because a queue always speeds up once the people in it stop hoping. The flatbeds set the interval and not me. My work was to have the next block standing on the marked ground with its spacing already right at the moment a tailgate came back down, and if I was 90 seconds late, nobody died any slower, and 6 drivers sat in the heat with nothing to do. I never told them. It was not a mercy, it was a technique. I did not tell them, and I did not lie to them either. I said that households would be called forward by plot number to the transit ground. I said that the intervals between calls might lengthen, and that this was normal. I said at every single call, in the flat, unhurried voice out of the mast, that nobody was late. Every word of it honest, the whole of it a lie, exactly as I had built it at Vorlock on the last day, exactly as my father built it before me. And if there is one thing in all of this that I would take back, it is not the calling. It is that phrase. That phrase was the sharpest thing I owned, and I used it on my own people twice. They knew by the 3rd day. Of course they knew. 440 people walk out onto a flat white plain in the morning, and none of them come back. and there is nothing out there taller than your knee to hide behind. By the third day, there was not a person in those 90 sheds who did not know. And on the third day, I called Plot 211, and a household of 5 walked out to the marshalling pen exactly as instructed. And the father stopped and looked up at the mast and did not say anything, and then went on. That is what the third day looks like, not screaming. A man looking up at a speaker and then walking. Shed 12 went on the third day, because Shed 12 is a low number and I had built the order off plot numbers with the north end first. Falk came to me on the second evening and asked me to take him to whoever held the schedule. He did not ask me what was happening out on the flats. He knew by then, the same as everybody knew. He had the book under his arm and he had put on the shirt he kept for the office, and he asked in the way a foreman asks for a requisition, and I took him because I was staff by then and could walk a man across the assembly ground without anybody stopping either of us. In his own head, he was answering the confessor. The finding had named him. The office was down as an irregular rite requiring correction, and Joram Falk had spent 11 days believing that the thing standing between him and the Imperium was 3 years of a boiler foreman getting half the words wrong. The book was an answer to a charge that had already been eaten by a larger instrument, and nobody had told him, and nobody was going to, because the 2 documents were not in the same file and had never once been in the same room. Grell read the book for the better part of 10 minutes. That is a long time to stand and watch a man read. He turned it back and forth and he checked 3 of the plot numbers against his own sheet, and then he said that it was well kept, which from him was an unusual quantity of speech. Then he explained what it was worth. The schedule was 4,000 names in the order I had read them into a Tau recorder 3 years earlier, which is to say, Q order at a table in the open, which is no order at all. It had no plots against it. Working out which name lived in which shed was the slow half of the whole operation, and it was being done by 2 adepts with a cogitator that kept losing Salt World Gothic. They had my slate, and every name in it had gone through an alien machine and come out spelled the way a Tau hears a Salt World mouth, and no 2 of those spellings agreed with the schedule. It told them everything and let them find nobody. Falk's book had names against plots against dates, 3 years of it, in Gothic, in a human hand, spelled the way people actually said them out loud, cross-checked every evening by a man who did not know how to do a thing badly. Grell entered it as a working annex to the schedule and told me it would save the better part of 2 days. Falk asked whether the 3 years made any difference. That is the only question he asked. Grella answered him without unkindness and without pausing, because the answer was not difficult. The finding is against the schedule. The schedule is answered by persons. Your name is on the schedule. It makes no difference to the instrument what a person did in the interval, because the instrument does not have an interval in it. And then he thanked him for the book. Falk went back to his block. He did not curse the Ordos, and he did not curse me, and he did not say anything to his people that night that made my job harder, which I know because I was awake for most of it listening to what the sheds sounded like. On the 3rd morning, I called Shed 12 forward, by plot number in the voice, and Joram Falk started the office at the front of his own block, and the whole of that morning's call took it up behind him, 360 people out of 8 sheds, and they walked the 400 paces to the chord, saying it. 9 years on the speakers, and I had never once got out of a crowd what that got out of them. It held the spacing to a hand's width. It set a pace, an even one, the same pace all the way down the line, and it kept the back of the block moving at exactly the rate of the front, which is the thing you spend a career chasing and never get. After the first call, I stopped talking. There was no reason to talk. Shed 12 was the only block in 11 days that needed one instruction and nothing else, and it went out onto that plane in better order than anything I ever built with a microphone. From the fourth day, I had somebody start the office in the pens before each call. Not every block took it up, and I did not push it where it did not take. Where it took, the pens ran quiet and the walking stayed even, and we gained about 40 minutes a day, and that is where the pace came from towards the end. I had been telling myself the pace came from people giving up hope. Some of it did. Grella's copy of the book went back to the sector with the closed instrument. It is in the file as an annex, and the annex has a heading on it, and the heading is that it constituted an aid to the ordering of persons. That is what Joram Falke's 3 years are. In the archive of the Imperium, he never once stopped believing in. An aid to the ordering of persons. There was one break. On the fourth afternoon, a young man from the eastern sheds went over the wire between 2 blocks and ran north, and he got about 300 meters before the sentries dropped him, and 400 people in the marshalling pen watched it happen. That is the moment where a line goes, and everybody who has ever worked a floor knows it, and there are about 4 seconds in which the whole thing is decided. I did not acknowledge it. I did not say a word about the man. I did not pause. I did not change my pitch. I ran the next call on schedule, in the same voice. Gate is the north chord, plot 240 through 246. Walk on. The intervals may lengthen. That is normal. And 400 people took the instruction because for 9 years I had been the thing in the roof that keeps talking when something goes wrong under it, and the sound of me continuing was worth more to them than the sight of him falling. Nobody else ran, not one in 11 days. There was nowhere to run to, and every one of them knew it better than I did. Sink country in all directions, flat and white and open, not a stick of cover in a day's walk, and the only sweet water within 200 kilometers was the well under the sheds they were being walked away from. Half that settlement had come up out of the southern belt 3 years earlier and knew exactly what open ground does to a person carrying nothing. The wire was a formality. The wire was there so that the Vestran 61st had something to stand on the correct side of. What they did instead was ask to go early. From the 5th day, households started coming up to the pens ahead of their own plot numbers, 4 and 5 and 9 at a time, asking me to call them out of order so that they would not have to sit behind a shed door listening to the calls come nearer. I let them. It cost nothing. It kept the daily figures even, and Grella did not care in what order a name was answered, so long as it was answered. Those were the only requests anybody made of me in 11 days, and I granted every one of them. I never went out to the trench. The caller works the assembly ground and the marshalling pen and stops at the cord, and past the cord it is a different trade and other men do it. But 11 kilometers on a sink flat is not the same as 11 kilometers anywhere else, because there is nothing out there to break anything up, no ridge, no stand of anything, and on a still morning with the air lying flat, the sound comes back across that ground almost whole. It does not arrive as shooting. It arrives as a flat knocking, spaced out, the sound freight sheeting makes when a crew is unloading it one piece at a time onto a hard floor a long way off, and if you did not know what it was, you would think somebody was working. By the second morning, I had understood that the assembly ground could hear it, so I fitted the schedule to the acoustics. I put the loud part of my day, the plot numbers and the walk-on instructions, and the standing announcements about water and the Medicae tent, into the windows when the flats were talking, and the silences into the windows when they were not. And the wind came up around the 9th bell every morning without fail and took it all away to the south. 360 people at a time stood in a pen 11 kilometers from a trench and heard instead a man giving out plot numbers in a steady voice about a transit ground. That was the actual work, not the calling. The calling was the easy part. The Vestrand 61st rotated their line detail every second day, which I thought was well managed. There was a trooper of about 18 who was sick against the wheel of a transport at the assembly ground on the 6th morning, in front of about 200 people who were waiting to be called, and his sergeant took him behind the vehicle without a word, and somebody else stepped up into his place inside a minute, and the 200 people watched all of it. Their commissar walked the wire twice a day for the entire 11 days and never once had to do anything, and by the end, he had stopped wearing his cap. I slept well every night of those 11 days. A man who has run a floor for 11 hours sleeps. The unscheduled went in against the names of the dead, as Grello had written it. The 26 adults without record, and the 152 born in the Sink country. Most of those were small, so they went with the households they had been born into, which meant that a woman would come up to the line carrying a child of 18 months, and I would call a name off the schedule that belonged to a brine worker who had died of the fever in the second winter, and the woman would answer to it on the child's behalf. Grell needed the name answered. She wanted to carry her own baby rather than have somebody else do it. Those are the terms on which that happened. I am not going to dress it. Shed 41 went on the 8th day. Ilka had them singing in the pens. That was not sentiment. It was crowd management of the first order, and she and I had agreed it beforehand in about 9 words, because 150 children who are singing are not 150 children who are asking. There was a girl in that school, 9 years old by then, who had come out of the port creche and who had spent 6 days at Vorlach, standing underneath the roof speakers looking up at them, because she thought the voice lived up there. She came through the marshalling pen and stopped and found the mast and looked up at it, exactly the way she had at 7, to see where I was. I called the next plot number. I did not stop. Ilka had been on the retained staff list from the first day, at my request, and for 8 days she worked the pens with me. On the 8th evening she learned what retention had cost, which is that a woman from the 26 unrecorded had been entered against the name Donneborg and had been instructed to answer to it. Somebody told her. It was not a secret. Grella's schedule hung on a board in the processing shed where anyone could read it, because none of this was hidden, because a correct act does not require concealment, and that is the single thing about the Holy Ordos that I have never been able to get any listener to feel properly. She did not come and find me. She did not shout at me, or weep at me, or explain anything to me. Ilka Donneborg was not a woman who made speeches, and I had known that since the day I first told her to use her chit. On the 9th morning, I called the name Donneborg from the mast, at the correct place in the plot order, in the voice, and she came out of the staff enclosure and walked past the marshalling pen and answered it. The unrecorded woman was standing right there, already stepped forward, already answering, and Grella's clerk had the mark half made, and then there were 2, and a name cannot be answered twice. I kept calling. Every man in that theater knows it, and it is in the file. There were 360 people in the pens behind her that morning, in good order, holding their spacing. And if I had come off that mast, the whole 11 days would have come apart in a minute. And so I gave the next plot number, and the next, and the next, and I finished the day's calls, and the count closed at the correct hour. Grella recorded an overcount of 1 and corrected it before the evening meal. The unrecorded woman was struck from the schedule, and since she was then a person not on the schedule and not required, And since the balance from Bright had been raised to 62, one for my name and one for hers, one of the 62 was surplus. He drew a line through a name. A woman from the brine cruise at Bright, who had been standing on the sink flats for 9 days, spreading lime for the Imperium, was put back on a truck on the 10th morning and driven 6,000 kilometers home. She is alive now, and she knows exactly what she spent 9 days doing, and nobody has ever come to ask her to be quiet about it. 61 went in with the last 2 days. They had dug and limed and hauled for 9 days. On the 10th, they were formed up in their own compound and marched 100 meters into the marshalling pen, and I called 61 names off the schedule that belonged to people who had died of the sink fever in a settlement they had never seen. I called them clearly and gave each one its own weight, the way you do when the name is all a person is going to get. On the 11th day, I called my own name. Torv answered it. He answered on the first call from the correct side, because I had spent an evening standing on his deaf flank until he learned to turn. And he went out onto the flats at the head of the last block of 40, and he set the pace for every one of them. Steady, the way I had known he would, because you put your best man at the front of a line. The count closed at 4,000 names answered in 11 days, with one break, no crush, no children lost at a gate, and no soldier of the Vestrand 61st required to fire into a crowd. Grella signed it. Interrogator Quist countersigned it. The bill of correction went back to the sector as a closed instrument, and the return of 4,000 souls lost at the port facility of Vorlach stands to this day correct, unamended, and true. Nobody was punished. Duran Melcaster was never charged because there was nothing to charge him with. His return was correct and had been made correct by the only means available, and a man who files a correct return has done his duty. I learned 2 years afterwards that he had died anyway, of something ordinary on a resettlement world in the passage, drawing his pension, 11 months before I ever came off that mast. His signature outlived him and killed 4,000 people. The grant is still there. The Earthcast had done something to that soil that our own agronomists could not undo and did not want to, so the 90 sheds were surveyed and cleaned and put back into use, and labor was brought up from the southern brine belt to work the ground from Bright, from the same pools that supplied the 61. There are families living in Shed 41. There are children in that school now. The crop is entered against the Sundrach Levy district and helps make up the arrears on the reagent salt, which had to be paid in the end regardless, because that is what an abatement is when it is finished with you. The Vestrand 61st stayed in the passage. Nobody broke them up and nobody went through them afterwards looking for men who talked, because there was nothing a man of theirs could have said that would have cost him anything. 2 of their officers were commended. The commissar, who walked our wire twice a day for 11 days and never once had to do a thing, has a regiment of his own now, somewhere south of the passage, and I hope for their sake that he has gone back to wearing the cap. Interrogator Quist said one further thing to me, and then I never saw her again. On the last evening, she signed the closure, and she told me that the file would record the operation as conducted without incident, and that this phrase was all the mercy the instrument allowed, because it meant that no name in it would ever be examined again by anybody. She said it in the same flat voice she used for everything else, and I understood that she had been giving me the technique back, and that she had known from the first morning that I would recognize it. Then she asked me, with what I believe was actual professional curiosity, how I had built the phrase about the intervals lengthening. I told her. She wrote it down. They have used me 4 times since, and on 2 of those worlds the crowd knew the voice before I opened my mouth. The broadcast gets everywhere eventually, on ships, the way everything out there does, and there are people standing in those compounds who have heard 4 minutes of me reading names and know what the name of that port means now. I have had a pen of 900 settle on the first call, because the voice belonged to the man who was with the 4,000 of Vorlach, and everybody knows what was done to them. So that voice cannot possibly be the Imperium's. They are wrong, and it holds them better than any officer alive could. The Tau built me a reputation, and the Ordos are spending it. Ashenkel, which was a resettlement world with a compliance problem in the 3rd District. Dremel Station twice, which is an orbital and much harder since a station crowd has no horizon and goes bad in half the time. And a place I will not name, since I never learned what it was called, where the population was 11,000, and the finding was not a return at all, but something else, and where it took 19 days. I am better at it now than I was on the Sink Flats. I asked for and received a proper mast rig with directional heads, because a single omnidirectional source in an open compound produces an echo off the far wire that costs you about 1.5 seconds of intelligibility. It arrived in 11 weeks, which for the Munitorum is indecent haste. I changed the marshalling pens on Ashenkel so that the walk from the pen to the line has a turn in it, since a straight sight line lets the back of a queue see the front of it, and a queue that can see its own front is a queue you are about to lose. On Dremel, I stopped using household order and went to plot order, with the households kept adjacent, which sounds like the same thing and is not, and which cut the day by 90 minutes. They asked me to set the method down. I did it in 14 pages. It has a form number now. I have seen it quoted on a requisition. It is in use in at least 2 theaters of the Kren passage that I know of, and there are men reading my phrasing off a printed sheet on worlds I will never see, and some of them are quite good, and none of them are as good as me since they are reading and I never read. The Tau are still broadcasting Vorlach. That was the last thing I learned, and it is the reason I am sitting in this room. After the correction, they cut a new preamble onto the front of it and pushed it out across the whole passage and every system beyond, the way everything out there moves, on ships, slowly and impossible to call back. Now the 4 minutes of me saying Hanna Vosterlin, Anders Vosterlin, Peret Ilms comes with a piece at the beginning. It explains, in careful low Gothic, that these 4,000 people were abandoned by their own species, kept alive for 3 years by the greater good, recovered by the Imperium, and shot in 11 days on the sink flats of Sundrach to make a document true. The preamble is read by Marl Hessig. They have played it to me 3 times, and it is her, the woman who stood off to one side on the northern approach with an aquila on her forearm that she had never bothered to have taken off. She is not good at it. It does not matter in the slightest, because whoever built the thing she is reading is very good indeed. There is no argument in it. There is no greater good in it either, not once, not 1 syllable. It is 40 seconds of what happened in order, with the figures in the right places and a pause before the last of them, and then it stops and lets me talk. Ruan spent 3 years explaining things to me, and I told him twice to stop. He learned it in the end. He learned it off me. Then my voice. 4,000 names, each one given its own weight, read by a man at the top of his trade. Ruan was right about it in every particular. A record is a defense. He simply did not say whose. That broadcast has done more damage in the passage than the fighting has, and you cannot answer a thing like that by denying it, because every name in it is real and checkable. So what the Ordos have decided to do instead is to have a voice of their own. The same voice. Not a recording of it, which can be matched and dismissed, but the whole of it, every sound it can make in every order, so that a machine can be given a sheet of text on any world in the sector and put my voice on it. The machine is not new. They have had the pattern a very long time, and the Ordos use it for other work. And the expensive part of the whole business is not the machine. It is the 10 hours. My father lost his voice at 44, and nothing of it was kept, because nobody keeps a caller's voice. It ends when he does, and the next one comes up out of the port school and learns the 2 rules. Mine is not going to end when I do. That is what the 10 hours are. Nobody has told me, and nobody needs to. I worked it out on the 2nd morning, when the technician asked me to read a list of nonsense syllables that no man has ever needed to say in his life. And I did not stop reading, and I have given him clean audio for 9 hours and 40 minutes because a job done badly is the only thing I have ever been frightened of. 20 more minutes, and the library is closed. I have not asked what happens after that, and I will not. There is a voice, and there is a man attached to the voice, and once the first can be produced without the second is an expense with an opinion. My name has already been answered once, on a white flat plane by a man who laughed slightly before the end of his jokes. There is no schedule difficulty. There is nothing at all to unmake. Warden Brent stood in my doorway in the first winter with his cap in his hands and told me that a man has to be under something. I gave him an answer at the time that I thought was quick. I have been under the Holy Ordos rather longer now than he was ever under the greater good, and I am better fed than he was, and better housed, and in all that time I have not been asked to do one thing I was not already good at. The technician has just held up his hand with the fingers spread. 5 minutes. Somewhere out there in the passage there is going to be a compound with wire on the inside as well as the outside, and a mast, and 360 people in the morning who have not been told anything for 6 days. There will be a child in it who looks up at the mast to find out where the voice is. There always is. And the voice that comes down out of the rig at first light will be mine. And it will be very good. And it will not tell them to hurry. It will tell them that loading is continuing. And it will tell them that the intervals may lengthen and that this is normal. It will tell them that nobody is late.